On average, 2.5 million children visit the emergency room each year, and that's around 70,000 children that in a day that emergency care pediatricians all over the nation work day and night to treat. My name is Yoojin Kim, and my dream is to be like one of these pediatricians to help children in need of medical attention. And ever since I was little, I was interested in the medical field because I spent a day in the hospital visiting my aunt who was a general doctor, and it seemed like she could magically solve all of her patients' problems, which really left an impact on me. And since that day onwards, I wanted to pursue a career that would allow me to do that as well. So a little bit about me. I was born in Seoul, South Korea, and we moved back and forth between Korea and America a couple of times before we finally settled down in America during my 5th grade year. And I play the flute, and this is my 4th year in the Frisco High School Band. I have one older brother who is currently a junior at Texas A&M, and we love to go travel. I chose to take ISM because I wanted to have the opportunity to get a head start on learning what a career in pediatrics would be like, and it would allow me to branch further out into the adult world and be confident in interacting with adults. So during and outside of ISM, the quote that I have chosen to represent my journey is "Believe and act as if it were impossible to fail." And within ISM, I learned that you have to really break out of your shell and be confident in what you do, and so I thought this was a very fitting quote. So I had a total of 6 interviews, and because I started off the year not knowing which subspecialty of pediatrics I wanted to be in, I interviewed pediatricians of different and various fields. And it was really fun to interview the different fields because I could see how different all of the subspecialties were, but also very closely associated with each other. The first interview I had was with Dr. Gruchala, and she is the professor of pediatric allergy and immunology, and she was very friendly, and she made my first interview feel a lot more comfortable and relaxed because of her great personality. And one interesting thing about her was that she worked at Parkland's and Children's, meaning that she saw patients that were both adults and children, so that was really cool to see how that interaction or like differences came to be. And her major research interest was why cases of allergy have grown recently among children. And she said that this was a worldwide phenomenon and that pediatricians all over the world were trying to figure out the cause of it. And one explanation she gave was that because the levels of pollution and smog have grown exponentially, that especially in third world countries where they didn't have a lot of medical attention, these children would not have the sufficient medical attention that would allow them to treat their allergies. And when I told her that I wanted to be involved in the medical field and be a pediatrician, one advice she gave me was to be involved in volunteer work, especially in the hospital, and then you can get a feel of how you can fit in within the hospital and what exactly you want to do. The second interview I had was with Dr. Hennis, and he is the Chief Division of Pediatric Emergency Medicine, and he is actually the one who gave me the contact information of Dr. Okada, who is my current mentor, so I really appreciated that. And he is more involved in administrative work than he is in clinical work because he is the chief of his division, which is Pediatric Emergency Medicine. And he spends a majority of his time going to meetings and filling out paperwork because he's more involved in administrative, but he also does treat patients time to time and go down to the ER. He also said that his work never gets boring or repetitive because of the variety of cases that are brought in daily. He says that the conditions brought to the ER rooms range from very minor to very severe cases, and so that always keeps him on his toes. And he also explained that the work schedule of a emergency medicine pediatrician is very different from someone who's not in that field or of a pediatrics, because the ER is open 24/7, and so they would have to work in shifts. And he also said that he needed to do constant research on new technology and techniques that came out within the medical field even after he graduated medical school. The third interview I had was with Dr. Iannacone. She is the chief of child neurology, and like Dr. Hennis, because she is the chief, she mainly did administrative work. and her specialization was in muscular dystrophy, which was over the loss and weakness of muscle mass. And Dr. Ayana Cohn said that the most important trait to have was empathy, because she would have to tell patients and parents alike that they would have bad news. And so it was very important to make them feel understood and make them feel like their pain was shared so that she could ease their hardships. And she also said it was important to educate parents and correct any misinformation, because sometimes parents did come in with false information that they heard online or through hearing through other parents, and so it was her job to correct these false information. The fourth interview I had was with Dr. Norcross. He is the professor of child psychiatry, and a really cool thing about him was that he also worked with children in foster care, so he would see their mental changes and if they had any psychological distress from the environment they were living in, which I thought that was really cool. And he also mentioned that he treats patients both through medication and psychotherapy depending on their condition, and he sees both behavioral and developmental changes. And he said that psychiatry is different from other branches of pediatrics because the changes are very incremental, so the changes seen weren't immediately seen, and he couldn't provide immediate relief, which was kind of frustrating for the parents and patients because the changes seen would take time. The fifth interview I went to was with Dr. Okada. She is my mentor, and I asked her to be my mentor because I could sense that she was very passionate about her job, and she had a great level of expertise during the 30 minutes I interviewed her, which was really great. And like Dr. Hennis said, she also said that she had no fixed work schedule, and so sometimes she would have to work all days and get the nights off, or work all nights and get the days off. And so it was just really important to find a balance in adapting to her new schedule. She also said that the ER is not as glamorous as the TV portrays it. She says it's not like Grey's Anatomy or any other favorite medical TV shows. She said most of the cases were due to fevers or diarrhea, vomiting, things like that. Those were the most common. And the three most important skills she thought to have as a pediatric or someone working in the emergency medicine field was communicating skills, multitasking, and gaining trust quickly. She said that because it does get very busy in the ER, it was important to work as efficiently as she could and gain trust quickly so that her patients would open up to her faster. And one thing she wanted to know more about was the business of medicine, which was the health system or the health insurance policies and things like that. And she said that although they taught her a little bit about it during medical school, it wasn't enough where she would be allowed to answer questions of her own. And she also said that children are not little adults, meaning that she would have to meet to their eye level. The last interview I went to was with Dr. Yoojin OW. She is the Associate Professor of Pediatric Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation, and I entered this interview having no idea what that meant, but her main job was to restore basic functions such as breathing and walking, and she would teach patients how to do that without assistance. And she said that because the boundaries of PMR are not clearly defined, she would have many responsibilities that were wide in range. And she also was very heavily involved in teaching work at UT Southwestern, and so she would have to do constant research and keep up with her knowledge of the different fields because her students would bring new questions to her each day, and she would have to be able to answer them. She also said that every child in every case is different, meaning that if a child comes in and they have similar symptoms, you can't treat them the same because it's very different for every child. And when I told her I wanted to go into medical school, her advice to me was to have persistence. And she said it was important to have persistence because although medical school was very long and difficult, it was really worth it in the end, and if you stuck to it, it would be worthwhile. And an interesting thing I learned from this interview was that there are only 222 pediatricians that are certified in physical medicine and rehabilitation, so she said that there was definitely a great need for them. On to my research. I researched topics that I found interesting after going through interviews or learning through them about other research topics. And the first research was about the challenge of communicating with pediatric patients. And I knew that it was important to gain the trust of your patients, and that communication was probably the biggest factor in getting someone to trust you. And this article talked about making children feel respected, listened to, and understood so that they would be comfortable with a physician that they saw for the first time. And I learned that the surroundings of a patient's, such as the hospital or the office that they were in, were very important because children were definitely influenced by the smells and sounds of the environment. It also talked about the triad of interaction, which is between the patient, the parent, and obviously the pediatrician. And it was very important to have the parent included in this interaction because children often could not communicate themselves very well to the pediatrician or someone that they saw for the first time. So it was important to make sure the parent was with them so that they could aid in any communication problems they might have. And also it was important for the parent to know what was going on with their child. And it also talked about the importance of pediatricians communicating with their patients because it is essentially the child's introduction into the health system, and how they viewed the health system would carry on for the rest of their lives. I conducted my second interview after I had my interview, or I conducted my second research after I had my second interview with Dr. Guchala, and it was about who is allergies and why, children and allergies. And I learned that 6 million children in the U.S. Had some sort of food allergy, and they were in danger of anaphylaxis, which were life-threatening conditions that brought from allergic reactions. And I also learned that the tendency to develop allergies are hereditary, meaning that most children, not all of them, but most, when they had allergies, it would be passed down from their parents, which I thought was pretty interesting. And the 4 main triggers that caused allergies were outdoor, which would be anything from pollen or seeds, and indoor, like dust, irritant, which were the most common type of trigger, and food. The third research assessment I conducted was after I did my interview with Dr. Iannacone, and it was about the causes and inheritances of muscular dystrophy. And like I mentioned earlier, muscular dystrophy is the weakness and loss of muscle mass, and it happens when the mutated gene fails to produce a functional dystrophin. And I also learned that it was more common among males than it was in females because females have an extra X chromosome that can help deactivate this mutated gene. And children with muscular dystrophy can seem very clumsy at first because they fall and stumble a lot, but it's actually because they have weaker muscles than normal children. And the top picture shows that how it's passed down through genes and hereditary, and the bottom picture shows that the patients with muscular dystrophy have a much smaller muscle mass than those who don't have muscular dystrophy. My fourth research assessment I did was about delivering bad news to parents of pediatric patients. And as a pediatrician, this delivering bad news is they want to avoid, but it's pretty much inevitable because at some point they do have to communicate bad news to parents that is devastating. And it talked about how a physician's communication skills play a role in how families cope with the news. And this article talked about pediatricians needing to be honest and upfront about anything that needed to be said instead of holding anything back. And like Dr. Iannacone mentioned, that they needed to be empathetic and they needed to make sure that the parents knew that they were understood and that someone else was sharing their pain with them. So it was very important. And body language and attitude was also important in the pediatrician's way of conveying bad news. The fifth research assessment was done over the UNT field trip, and during this trip I had a chance to sit in 3 of the college major classes that I chose, and I was very pleasantly surprised to find that I could actually follow some of the lessons, and it was fun to sit in and for a day and act like I was a college kid. And so my first class I went to was Introductory Biology for Science Majors, and this class had about 150 to 200 students in it, which was something that was new for me, but I also enjoyed because we learned about Punnett squares and genetic links. And after this class, Professor Burleson, who was our teacher, took a couple of ISM kids to his research lab, and so it was really cool to see what a college-level aquatic research lab looked like. The second class I went to was for abnormal psychology, and we watched a video over patients in mental institutions, and the kids took notes over the conditions each patient had. And then the third class I went to was for general chemistry for science majors, and this class actually turned out to be a help session for students that needed help on homework or anything like that. And so because not many students came for help, I just had a really nice chat with the professor, and he just gave me a lot of tips on what college was like and what I should major in if I wanted to pursue a career in pediatrics. The most recent research assessment I did was about arrhythmia in children, and arrhythmia is the irregular beating of the heart, and it was separated into bradyarrhythmia, which was the very slow beating of the heart, and tachyarrhythmia, which was very fast. And I learned that the symptoms were very wide, and so some patients would have unnoticeable and no symptoms at all, while some other patients would have very painful symptoms that would be life-threatening. And I learned that it occurs when the heart's pacemaker, which is the sinus node, it develops an abnormal rate, or it starts producing an irregular heartbeat, or when the pathway of the electrical currents that makes the heartbeat is interrupted. So on to my original work, I studied the differences between emergency rooms and local urgent care clinics, and I decided to study this after I had a talk with Coach Goff, and we talked about the differences between the two. And I was interested in it because we saw a sudden emergence of local urgent care clinics and the widespread popularity of them, and I realized that the majority of the public would not be very well educated on when or why to visit each center. So I studied the differences in cost, technology, waiting time, proximity, techniques, and I also found the advantages and disadvantages of each. I also started off my original work by surveying the faculty of FHS to see what kind of conditions they brought to each medical facility. And so the first question I asked was, for what reasons did you visit the ER at a hospital if you have ever visited? And I learned that the most common reason was broken bones, and through this outcome I realized that pediatricians really want people to be educated in where to go, because broken bones can easily be treated in the local urgent care clinics, but because hospital ER rooms are not based on a first come, first serve, the patients have to wait a longer time if they are more severe patients that need help before they do. And following broken bones, deep cuts, car accidents, and fevers were some of the top reasons for visiting an emergency room. The second question I asked was, for what reasons did you visit a local urgent care clinic if you have ever visited? And the most common reason was because of the flu or common cold, and I suspect that this is because that the patients who needed to visit their doctor's office was closed, or it was after hours. And the last question I asked was, what do you think is the biggest priority when deciding to visit a hospital emergency room or a local urgent care clinic? And the majority of the people responded that it was the severity of illness, which I agree with, but there were also a couple of other people who said that the cost and proximity were the most important when deciding where to go. And after more research on the differences in technology and techniques used, I brainstormed ideas of 20 common symptoms that you could visit the emergency room or local urgent care clinic, and depending on the cost and where it was more advantageous to go, I wrote where it was more beneficial for the patients. So far, I've learned a lot through my ISM journey, and hopefully I can continue to learn more about pediatrics through attending UT Austin next fall. And I plan to be a psychology major, and my ultimate goal is to attend medical school. I'm excited for what ISM has to offer with mentor visits and observations. Thank you.